Okay, we're looking at church, a relationship to a way of life. This will be part 3. We see in Acts 9, verse 2, that Saul was looking for any of this way. Again, speaking of a way of life, we've seen thus far that as members of the Lord's churches, we should be committed, dedicated to a very particular way of living. And it is kingdom of God living. We see that in the Sermon on the Mount. We saw last week that that requires that we have right values. That is, that we put proper value where it belongs. That, of course, leads to right loyalties. If you do not have right values, you will not have right loyalties. That leads to right concerns, and that leads to right pursuits, and overall it's just a life of carefulness. This way of living we want to consider tonight is a way of discipleship. We read in Acts 9 and verse 1 that the subject of Saul's persecution were the disciples of the Lord. One of these that were living in Damascus, who were of this way, was Ananias. And he's identified in Acts 9, verse 10, as a disciple. A disciple is a follower. Disciples of the Lord are followers of the Lord. They are students, they are pupils of the Lord. They are adherents to Jesus Christ. They have been convinced, they have been persuaded, they have conviction concerning the person of Jesus Christ. Now, disciple of the Lord, of course, that's something that's out in the open. There are no secret disciples. That's something that is manifest. Now, in the Gospels, Jesus wanted there to be no mistaking the life of discipleship. And he lays down very, very specific requirements of a disciple. In Matthew 16, verse 24, then said Jesus unto his disciples, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Then over in the book of Luke, chapter 14, we're going to be coming back to Matthew 16, but in Luke chapter 14, notice verse 26, verse 27. If any man come to me, hate not his father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, yea, in his own life, also, he cannot be my disciple. And whosoever doth not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Very strict, very to the point requirements. Verse 33. So likewise, whosoever he be of you that forsaketh not all that he hath, he cannot be my disciple. 3 times there in Luke, Jesus says he cannot be my disciple. If he does not meet these requirements, He is saying, let there be no mistake about it. He is not my disciple. And I feel it's very, very important that we understand this, because people want to have their own definition of a disciple, of a follower of Christ, which is a Christian. But we're not left to define the terms. Jesus has already set the terms, and they have not changed. And it's this way of life that is spoken of here in Acts chapter 9. In Matthew 16, and we've preached from this many times, the concluding call is, follow me. Follow me. Those two words summarize a life lived for Christ. Follow me. And those two words summarize this way of life that we read of in Acts chapter 9. So this life is summed up in those two words. Those two words define our life calling. If you want to put our life calling in the simplest terms, it is follow me. It is Christ saying, follow me. That's our life calling. That's what we're to do. That includes a lot of things, but that summarizes what we are to do. So Christ here, when he says, follow me, is speaking of a way of living that is far different from the thinking of the world, from the thinking of man, and even from the thinking of so-called Christendom. It's a way of living that stands contrary to the perceptions of the world, to the priorities of the world, stands contrary to the values and the concerns and the loyalties and the pursuits and the lifestyle of the world, and again, even so-called Christendom. A lot of people have a lot of ideas on what is a follower of Christ. But again, all those ideas, that's all they are. They mean nothing. Christ has already set the terms. And they're very strict. They're very strict. And again, this is the way of life that we read of in Acts chapter 9. So when he says, follow me, he's speaking of a way of life that goes beyond formality. It goes beyond mere appearance. It goes beyond the surface. It goes beyond theory. It goes beyond opinion. It becomes our life. And in Matthew 16, leading up to those words of verse 24, follow me, I believe you have the prerequisites of that life. Follow me. How do we do that? Do we just make up our mind one day, you know what, I'm going to start following the Lord? No, I don't think so. There is just like in the Sermon on the Mount, there's a very definite order to the Sermon on the Mount. And he's describing a life. And when you come here to Matthew 16, there is a very definite order. Christ spoke in a very orderly fashion. It wasn't scattered where no one could understand it. It was very orderly. And it's point by point. So we want to look at these prerequisites leading to follow me. Verse 13, when Jesus came into the coast of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, whom do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? And they said, so several of them spoke, some say that thou art John the Baptist, some Elias, and others, Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. He said unto them, but whom say ye that I am? And Simon Peter answered, speaking for all of them, and said, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now what Christ does here is lay the foundation of everything that follows, leading to the ultimate life of follow me. If we're going to follow him, we have to have a solid foundation. In verse 13, he asked the disciples a question concerning the world's perception of himself. Their answer is given in verse 14. And their answer reveals that the world merely speculates about Christ. That's all they do. They speculate about Christ. And in all their speculation, if he was John the Baptist or Jeremiah or Elijah, he's less than he is. In all their speculation, they make Christ less than who and what he is. And if you look at their conjectures there in verse 14, none of these things, if Christ is John the Baptist, does that change your life? Not really. If Christ is Jeremiah or one of the Old Testament prophets, does that have a lifelong impact upon you? No. So in all their conjectures, there was no life-changing impact upon them. And you will never, ever live the ultimate life of follow me without there being a life-changing perception of Jesus Christ. Has to be. He goes on in verse 15, and he asks a second question. But whom do ye say that I am? Peter, as he often did, acting as their spokesman, answers in verse 16. He says, thou art the Christ, the Son of God, the Son of the living God. That answer, there is a tone of assurance. In the other answers, it might be Jeremiah, it might be John the Baptist, might be one of the Old Testament prophets. Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. He's sure of it. There's a tone of certainty. There's a tone of conviction concerning the person of Jesus Christ. You may have a conviction, I go to the theater, I don't go to the theater, I go here, I don't go there. That's all fine. But it will not impact your whole life. What you need to have a real conviction upon is who is Christ. And that gives you a foundation for other convictions as well. But be sure of this, one will never live the ultimate life of follow me without personal assurance, without personal conviction and realization of who and what Jesus Christ is. So if we're going to follow Him, there has to be a life-changing knowledge and perception of Jesus Christ. That leads us to the second thing, which is a personal realization of God's grace in our life. Verse 17, and Jesus answered. He's replying to Peter, and said unto him, directly to Peter, in the hearing of all, blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto thee. Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. Peter, you are blessed. Flesh, you did not come to that perception by flesh and blood. Flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto thee, but my Father, which is in heaven. So, in response to Peter's answer, Christ reminded Peter of what he was, all because of the grace of God. He says, blessed art thou. Christ tells Peter that he has been personally blessed of God. And he called him by name. He said, blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, son of Jonah. By using his name, he's reminding him of the unworthiness, of his own unworthiness of the blessing. All you are is Simon Bar-Jonah, but blessed art thou. That's grace. And then he reminds Peter of the source of that blessing, flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto thee, but my Father, which is in heaven. Again, everything is leading up to verse 24. Follow me. In order to live that life, there must be a personal realization that we are blessed of God. And that we are blessed by the grace of God. We are unworthy of any of the blessings of God. Anything that we know spiritually, flesh and blood hath not revealed it, but the Lord by grace has revealed it. We are the objects of God's amazing grace. And what this does is it feeds an even greater knowledge and perception of the person of Jesus Christ. Thirdly, there has to be a personal realization of our own insufficiency and the sufficiency of Christ. Verse 18. Everybody knows verse 18. But verse 18 is hardly ever mentioned in the context of everything going on here. We love what verse 18 teaches, but we need to view it in its context here. And I say unto thee, that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. Christ very pointedly reminds Peter of his own insignificance. He had just said, blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah. Flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto thee, but my Father which art in heaven. Just in case, Peter, if you're getting a big head, I want to tell you you're insignificant. That's basically what Christ is saying here. He says, thou art Peter. Thou art Petros. In other words, you're just a mere stone. You're just a pebble. You're just a pebble. And reminding Peter of his insignificance and insufficiency, the Lord does what he often does, and he then directs his attention to himself. Thou art Peter, or a stone or pebble, upon this rock, pointing to himself, upon this Petra. So he's reminded Peter of his own insignificance. You're just a little stone. I'm the rock. I'm the rock. You are insignificant. You are insufficient in and of yourself. But I'm everything you need, is what he's telling them. He's saying this in the hearing of his disciples. What he's saying is, I am the foundation. I am the foundation. Again, everything is leading to follow me. Follow me. In order to live that life, there must be realization of our own insufficiency. There must be realization of his all-sufficiency. And this too feeds a proper knowledge and perception of Jesus Christ. Fourthly, there is a personal conviction that Christ's work cannot be thwarted. Verse 18 again. And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. This has a side note. People fail to realize here. Gates are not an offensive weapon. Gates are set up for defense. Which means what? That the church is to be on the offense. And the gates of hell, whatever gates Satan puts up, the church will prevail. But what he's reminding him here is that Christ's work, I'll build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it, my church. Why? Because it's built upon the foundation of himself. It's built upon the rock. Because it's his doing. Because it's his doing. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. Because of who he is. Because of what he does. And everything that leads to this life of follow me, all this leads to this life of follow me. There must be personal persuasion that he cannot be thwarted. Cannot possibly be defeated. If you believe that, if you're totally convinced of that, why would you follow anyone else? You're going to follow him. So there has to be this conviction. He's victorious. He cannot be defeated. So I'm going to follow him. Fifthly, there has to be a compulsion, a personal compulsion toward the will of God. Notice verse 21. From that time forth began Jesus to show unto his disciples how that he must go into Jerusalem and suffer many things of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised again the third day. So everything Jesus is telling these disciples on this occasion is because difficult times are coming. He is going to go to the cross. This would prove to be a very difficult and trying time for his disciples. So what Jesus is teaching us here in Matthew 16 is this is how you prepare for difficulty. You follow me. But in order to follow me, there's a lot of things that have to take place first. Now what Jesus said here in verse 21 is more than just a declaration of his sufferings and his death and his resurrection. He is setting forth his example. Notice what it was that Christ showed them. How that he must go into Jerusalem. He's not just showing them that he's going to suffer and be killed and raised again, but how that I must. I must. He's setting forth his own example. I must suffer. I must be killed. I must be raised again the third day. What we have here is a declaration of his compulsion. It's a declaration of his obsession and fixation of heart. It's a declaration of his spirit and his attitude toward the will of God. This is the will of God, that I suffer, that I die, that I be raised, and I must. He's setting forth in his own example. Again, everything's leading to the ultimate life of follow me. In order to live that life, there has to be a personal compulsion. There has to be a personal obsession. There has to be a fixation to do the will of God. Where does that come from? Well, it comes from a right perception of Jesus Christ. But whom do ye say that I am? That's where we get this compulsion, this fixation, this obsession, because of how we see Christ. In verse 22 and 23, Christ rebukes an attitude that is detrimental to this attitude that we need concerning the will of God. Peter took him, kind of took him off to the side. Oh, the nerve of Peter. And began to rebuke him. Began to rebuke him, saying, be it far from thee. What he's saying is, Lord, you're above suffering. You're above death. Be it far from thee, Lord, this shall not be unto thee. But he, Christ, turned and said unto Peter, get thee behind me, Satan. What Peter was telling Christ was satanic. Get thee behind me, Satan. For thou art an offense unto me. What Peter said to Christ was offensive to the Lord. For thou savorest, and here's the reason why Peter said this, for thou savorest not the things that be of God, but those that be of men. Here's what Peter was saying to Christ. Christ says, I must suffer, I must die. Peter says, spare yourself. You're above that. Spare yourself the discomfort, the inconvenience. Spare yourself of that. You're above that. In order to live this life of follow me, we must overcome this attitude of Peter. How many times God's people will say, why me? That's the attitude of Peter. In other words, I'm better than this. Why me? Why should I get cancer? Why should I get such and such a disease? Why does this happen to me? Why not? Why not you? Are you special? This was the attitude of Peter. And that attitude is everywhere. And it's detrimental to following Jesus Christ. And Christ would warn again of this in verse 25. He said, for whosoever will save his life shall lose it. And whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. Again, this has its basis in a proper knowledge and perception of Christ. I must do His will. That needs to be our compulsion. That needs to be our fixation. And if His will is for us to suffer, then so be it. It's His will. We're not above that. And if we think we are, that's satanic. And it's offensive to the Lord. And it's just proof that we savor the things of man rather than the things of God. And how many people do not follow Christ because they savor the things of men more than they do the things of God? I could stand up here and give examples all night long, but we won't. Sixthly, our will must be engaged to follow Christ. Again, everything's leading to this ultimate life. Follow me. Notice verse 24. Then said Jesus unto his disciples, if any man will come after me, if any man will, the word will speaks of desire. There has to be a desire to follow Christ. Many, if they were honest, if they were truly honest, would have to say, you know what? The truth is, I have more desire to do my own thing than to follow the Lord. I mean, if they're really honest, that's what they'd say. Nobody's going to say that because they're not honest enough. But if any man will, speaks of desire. Conveys also the idea of determination, resolve, aspiration, yearning, longing. It's a craving, it's an eagerness, it's an enthusiasm. If any man will. Again, everything's leading to this life of follow me. And if we're going to live that life, there must be a single-mindedness and firmness of purpose toward Christ. Notice what it says, if any man will come after me. This desire for Him must be stronger than any other desire that we have. It's a desire that takes priority over all the events of life. Notice, keep a mark there, but go to the book of Luke, chapter 9. Book of Luke, chapter 9. Verse 57 through verse 60. And it came to pass that as they went in the way, a certain man said unto him, Lord, I will follow thee whithersoever thou goest. All people say that all the time. And Jesus said unto him, foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man hath not where to lay his head. And he said unto another, follow me. But he said, Lord, permit me first. Oh, we hear that all the time. Notice the event that has taken place. Permit me first to go and bury my father. My father has died. It's time for his burial. Lord, I'll do that first. No, this takes place over all events. Jesus said unto him, let the dead bury their dead. But go thou and preach the kingdom of God. And another also said, Lord, I will follow thee, but let me first go bid them farewell which are at home at my house. This desire for Christ takes priority over all events in life, whether it be birth, whether it be death, or whatever. It takes priority over all things. It takes priority over all relationships in life. Notice Luke chapter 14. We've already read the verse. We'll read it again. Verse 26. If any man come to me and hate not his father, his mother, wife, children, brethren, sisters, yea, his own life, he cannot be my disciple. He must put Christ before all relationships. You're not going to follow Christ unless you're willing to put Christ ahead of all events. Because there's always going to be events. There's always going to be events. Unless you're willing to put Christ ahead of all relationships. There's always going to be relationships that get in the way. Always. It's not a matter of, well, I couldn't because this happened, or I couldn't because of this. That's not so. That's not even the issue. The issue is not the events. The issue is not the relationships. The issue is Christ ahead of all those things. That's the issue. And if He's not, we cannot be His disciple. Get right down to it. There aren't many disciples of the Lord. There has to be an attraction for Christ. Notice again verse 24. If any man will come after me, if any man will come after me. And then notice the last three words, and follow me. The words after and follow speak of a pursuit. And the word me refers to Christ, and He is the object of the pursuit. He is the object of the attraction. There must be an attraction to Christ, which again goes back to the very beginning. What is our perception of Jesus Christ? He must be considered to be worthy of all. Worthy of all. It's easy to say, well, Christ is worthy of everything. Yes, He is. But is that so in our life? There must be appreciation for Christ. There must be enjoyment of Christ. I'm convinced that there are a lot of saved people that do not enjoy Jesus Christ. They don't enjoy the Lord. They have a wrong perception of Christ. But our hearts have to have this appreciation for Christ. And then eighthly, if we're going to do this, verse 24, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself. Let him. Who's the him? The one who has a desire and attraction for Christ. If any man will come after me, let him deny himself. So just having a desire for Christ, just having an attraction to Christ is not enough to follow Him. But the desire and the attraction must be so great, so powerful, so influential, so dominant that it causes us to deny ourselves. To deny is to oppose ourselves. To oppose ourselves. To refuse ourselves. To turn down ourselves. Well, I feel like doing such and such. Well, turn down yourself. Refuse yourself. Dismiss self. Well, I feel this way. Everybody's feelings get in the way. Dismiss your feelings. It's not about your feelings. It's about Christ. Renounce, reject self. We're to deny self. Well, I gave up such and such, and I gave up this, and I gave up that. We're not talking about giving up things. We're talking about denying self. Big difference. It's a lot easier to give up a few things than it is to continually renounce yourself and deny yourself. Many have been led to believe that because they've given up certain things that they are disciples of Christ. And no doubt, there are things that need to be forsaken. There's no doubt about that. But you deny yourself, and all the other things that need to be forsaken will take care of itself. Deny self. Let him deny himself. Jesus stood opposed to the entire self system. The entire thing. He was opposed to it. He's opposed to self-righteousness. He's opposed to self-centeredness, self-interest, self-confidence, self-importance, self-indulgence, self-reliance, self-satisfaction. On and on we could go. Christ stands opposed to the whole self system. Deny himself. It means to repudiate self itself. Cease to consider our own ease. Cease to consider our own pleasure. Cease to consider our own agenda. Everyone has well, not everyone, but people have agendas. Deny yourself. To be done with self. It's to renounce our so-called right to rule ourselves. Oh, it's my life. I can do whatever I please. Well, first of all, it's not your life. And you cannot do whatever you please. We're to renounce our so-called right. Well, I have the right. I have the right. To deny self is to give up our own ways in order to be molded and shaped and trained and taught, to be transformed and to be conformed to the image of Christ. Deny self. We'll never truly follow him unless we deny self. Then also in verse 24, and take up his cross and follow me. Notice, after deny himself and. So there's a connection, showing us that the order is significant. The order is significant. You will not take up this cross unless you deny self. It's a prerequisite. Take up. Now this verse 24 has been mispreached, misrepresented all my life. Take up his cross. It says take up. That means lay hold of. Lay hold of his cross. And a denial of self is prerequisite to this. This cross that we're to take up is linked to the verb take. We're to take it. We're to take this cross. That tells me that it is not something that is laid upon us by the Lord. Well, I have such and such in my life. That's the cross the Lord has laid upon me. Well, that's not what this says. This is a cross that you take up. It's not a cross that's laid upon you. And that's how it's usually represented. You know, I have this difficulty in my life. I have this trial, this affliction, this sorrow, this heartache, this health problem. This is the cross that God has given me to bear. That's not what this is saying. Because this is something you take up. This is something you do voluntarily. Take up His cross. Take it up. Put it upon yourself. I believe it has direct reference back to verse 21 when Jesus began to show His disciples that He must suffer. It speaks of a principle of life. This cross is a principle. The cross is the expression of the world's hatred. What man did to Christ on the cross was an expression of their hatred. The cross that we're to take up is the world's hatred. In order to live this life that we're called to live, we must be willing to be hated. And you're not going to be willing to be hated unless you first deny yourself. The cross speaks of ridicule. We're to take it up. We're to be willing to be ridiculed and mocked and rejected. The cross speaks of mockery and rejection. We're to take it up. We're to be willing to have all these things done to us in the service of Christ and think nothing of it. When a felon was nailed to the cross, they were thought to be the scum of the earth. We're to be willing to be thought to be the scum of the earth. Oh, I'm being persecuted. I'm being persecuted. Sermon on the Mount again. Rejoice. Don't complain. Rejoice. The reason we complain is because we feel we deserve better. The reason we complain is because we haven't denied self. If we deny self, we're willing to be thought the scum of the earth for the cause of Christ. I believe it speaks of a voluntary surrender, a voluntary submission to the will of God, even if it involves ridicule, mockery, and to be thought the scum of the earth. It's to be voluntary. Take up His cross. We're to do so without any reserve, even unto death. We're to be willing to die on that cross. Willing to give all for His glory. Does not that go back to our very first point? What is our perception of Jesus Christ? Are we willing to go all the way? All the way. Where we're thought to be the scum of the earth and even killed. That requires us to deny ourselves. So in closing, what Christ is speaking of here corresponds to this way of Acts chapter 9. It is a way of life that is thoroughly, all-inclusively for Christ. It's an obsession with Christ. It's a way of living in which Christ is the purpose. Christ is the impulse. Christ is the object. It is a way of living in which Christ is the dominating and controlling factor of life. How many people call themselves Christians and they've never once walked in the footsteps of Jesus Christ? It is Christ, the passion of our life. He's the passion. Not family, not location, not jobs, not whatever. The list goes on and on and on. It is Christ, the passion of our life. And if we have a right perception of Christ and we realize the grace of God in our lives, that's not a problem. Christ being the passion of our life. It is life pursuing Christ. That ought to be our life. Again, Jesus is speaking these words because troublesome times were coming. He was going to die on a cross and they were going to be scattered. They needed to know these things. Troublesome times are here. More troublesome times are coming. And the only ones of God's people that are going to be what they ought to be are those who follow Christ. Nothing else is going to do. We need to hear these words. It's being identified with Jesus Christ. Identified with Christ. It's shameful what so many of God's people are identified with, rather than Jesus Christ. It is to live life with Him having the preeminence. It's to live life imitating and obeying Him, focused upon Him, committed to Jesus Christ. And if God's people are going to be what they ought to be, all of these things have to be there. Or we will not follow Christ. It's a life separated unto Christ. And this way that we read of in Acts 9 corresponds to a life of discipleship. A life of discipleship. We need to study Christ. We are to imitate Him. If we are going to imitate Him, we have to know Him. We have to know what He would do, how He would act. And it's not hard to figure because it's right here in the Gospels. We see it over and over and over. Oh, it may not be how you want to act, but it's very plain. God's people, and in particular, members of the Lord's churches, ought to be filled with men and women who are truly disciples of Jesus Christ. True disciples of Jesus Christ. That ought to be our desire. That ought to be our longing. That ought to be our plea. Lord, help me. Help me to follow You. Help me to imitate You. In order to do that, I have to deny my own thinking. I have to refuse my own thinking many times. I have to refuse my own desires. Have to refuse our own opinions and focus upon Jesus Christ. That is the key to living in these days in which you and I live. So church does involve a way of life. And it is a way, or should be a way, of discipleship, a way of following Jesus Christ. Brother Ben, if you'd come and lead us in